Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. I do have some show business to mention, but first let me bring on Ryan Turnipseed. Hello, sir.
Hello, we're speed running the introduction today.
Well, yeah, you've had a very exciting times recently, but I'm not even going to bring it up, except to
Good.
acknowledge, just so that we're not like acting like we're not existing in time, you know. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, as I said, with the excitement that Ryan's been through, which some of you may know about, he can relax talking about left-wing terror, right? A little return to normalcy in the middle of some craziness. Okay, so there's something we wanted to ask folks to do, and that is there's something our producer has been encouraging, and I was like, wow, there's this one piece that I don't exactly know how I'm going to get done, and then he says, try crowdsourcing it.
Yeah.
We make a show, we have a video editor willing to make clips from the show. You know, clip out like a 30-second to 60-second, kind of that range. You know, around a minute or so or less. Clip out a little section, and then we can post that as a teaser on Twitter and so forth to draw people into watching the episodes. This is good marketing, right? Marketing 101. In fact, I just was on an interview with Patrick Casey, um, and somebody called Dissident Clips, a small account, but he did a good job here. I'm sharing this with you right now. He shared a video on um, uh, Twitter where he clipped out about 1 minute from my interview with Patrick Casey. And if you watch it, I think you'll agree. He chose something that kind of it sort of stands on its own, but hopefully makes you want to watch the rest of the interview. Kind of draws you in. That's kind of what we're looking for, right? And I'm
Right.
just finding that I don't think it's realistic for me to think that I'm going to watch back through episodes and find clips and stuff. But somebody listening later, I think live is hard because you can't get a timestamp easily that makes any sense as far as I can tell. But probably someone who's watching not live, it's going to be easiest for you, maybe. I mean, I don't know. If you can figure it out live, do it. But uh, if you're watching later and you go, ooh, that would make a nice little clip right there, just jot down the timestamp and send it to me on Twitter or whatever. And that would be so helpful. I don't even need just the beginning timestamp is fine. If you know that it looks like it's about the right length, give me the beginning timestamp. We'll figure it out from there. And our video guy, who is also the one who makes our wonderful thumbnails, like the wonderful one today, will clip it out and we'll make something that we can push around on social media and so forth. Um,
Right, and keep in mind, we're not asking for you to go and comb through for like the smartest point in the show or the hardest hitting point necessarily. Just
no,
whatever
no,
resonated with you the most.
yeah,
It could even be the funny point that you found that was
yep,
somewhat funny. Yeah,
yeah,
so, something like that. And it doesn't have to be, I don't think, a full 30 seconds, just in the ballpark. So,
yeah,
don't hold yourself to too strict a standard if you come across
yeah,
these things when you're listening back. We want to hear from you.
absolutely, yeah. So really appreciate your help. And just want to again repeat, had some we've had some harder times economically. Haven't had a lot of people signing up to support the show. Having said that, we have some longtime supporters who keep on supporting the show through this, and I really appreciate it um, because there are costs to doing all this. Um, okay, so I think let's get right to it then, Ryan. Okay, so as Lady of Shalott was just mentioning in the live chat, we are drawing from the wonderful book Brian Burrow, Days of Rage. What's interesting about Days of Rage is, well, it's an interesting mix. There in the section we'll cover today, probably one of the most well known, um, you know, something that just swamped the media for a while in the 70s. One of the most well known incidents connected to all this happens. But then there's other parts of it where he says, no one ever seemed to even be curious about this. You know, all these bombings happen and no one even cared to like understand what happened and who did it and why they did it, you know. So it's a strange mix. So I think part of the reason this book is so important is that he looks at this left-wing terror throughout the 70s and he went back and dug as much as he could. I mean, he hits a lot of dead ends, frankly. People are dead or have disappeared. Um, But other times he's able to find someone who's willing to give an interview. He's able to find court records. He did a great job researching, and so it's a strangely little known era. A lot of, I mentioned on Patrick Casey's show that there were 1,900 domestic bombings in 1972, as we mentioned right at the beginning of the series, and he also, as based in red pilled as he is, was like, really? Wow. So this is not well known stuff for whatever reason, and I think it deserves to be better known, frankly. Okay.
And we also, the
Yeah.
book also does a good idea of name dropping people. Like for instance, and we'll get into this soon. The first chapter that we're going to start with, he just says, "Oh, and then Angela Davis was arrested in New York." He doesn't mention that Angela Davis would go on to be a major figure in the Communist Party, for
Right.
instance. So,
Right. Yeah.
there's a lot there. This is a very, very good book. But if he explored every little nook and cranny he could have, this would be like an encyclopedic volume,
Right.
rather than a short story.
Yeah. So let me start with a passage from a book called Soledad Brother by George Jackson, and then we'll give some context for who in the heck George Jackson was. He says, "Believe me, my friend, with the time and the incentive that these brothers have to read, study, and think, you will find no class or category more aware, more embittered, desperate, or dedicated to the ultimate remedy, revolution. The most dedicated, the best of our kind, you will find them in the Folsoms, San Quentins, and Soledads. They live like there was no tomorrow." And then he also includes at the beginning of this section a quote from Ho Chi Minh: "When the prison gates fly open, the real dragons will emerge." And so he titles this "The Dragon Unleashed" to begin with. So there's a little bit of an overlap here, but around the time that the Black Liberation Army, as we talked about last time, falls apart, is killed, defeated, something new starts. And one of the things he talks about a lot, and I was too little to know, and the history of that time is so confusing, right? In the way it's given to us and the way they hide so much as we're learning, that it's hard for me to totally understand what he's saying here. But basically, it's like late 60s, early 70s, the weathermen, they were getting interviewed in prominent papers. They were like well known. It was like celebrities. People were like, "Wow, that's cool, man. Action," And then just a couple years later, the period we're getting into, as you get into like 73, 74, it seems already like an anachronism that somebody would be going underground and doing revolutionary violence. And people are like, why are you still on about that? It's like somehow the mood shifted very quickly in the early 70s.
Right. Yeah. The broader culture and the New Left itself moves very quickly.
Yeah. It's a lot of rapid change, it seems like, in terms of what they're in. It's kind of trendy and faddish. I mean, maybe that's unfair to use those terms, but it's something like that.
No,
right?
that's exactly how I would describe it.
Yeah.
And we'll see why.
Yeah, right. So, there began to be some new cells, terrorist cells, armed cells, and but the nature of them changed. Remember, already in going from the Weathermen to the Black Liberation Army last episode in this series, we'd gone from these mostly Jewish, middle-class, college intellectual types who went to University of Chicago and stuff like this, to ex-cons who had been in the Black Panther Party in Harlem, right? So already we're looking at a class difference, a race difference, a cultural difference, right? And if anything, it gets even more of a shift, I think, in what we're heading into now, because how do I put it? It's almost like bio-Leninism, Ryan. Thinking back through, it's like the people involved get sort of lower in a way, it seems.
Right. Yeah. if you go
Let,
back to the
less
Weatherman episode,
exciting.
the competency, yeah, the competency is very different as well. If we
Mm,
remember the Black Liberation Army that we covered last time, um, I don't think that they necessarily made, or well, no, they didn't make the news in any way. What we're going to be describing this time, but even they, I think, felt more organized than what we're
hmm
going to talk about this time. And then going back to the Weathermen, they seem to be the most organized out of all. It's just been a downward slope into
Yeah.
just getting worse somehow.
Yeah, as I said in the marketing for this, I said this is where the story just starts to get weird, you know, where it's like uh, some of the individuals that we'll be getting into here, I think we're just mentally unhinged, you know. Well, one in particular, but well, that's later.
Yeah,
Uh,
it might be a good story for anyone in the modern day that will call themselves dissidents and then just let anyone into their groups without having any sort of character check or anything like that.
we were
Perhaps
just
there is a lesson.
we were just discussing that. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so there he says that the forerunners of these new groups had drawn their inspiration from the war or the civil rights movement, or the civil rights movement as it developed into like the Black Panther, Eldridge Cleaver and the Black Panthers, and got more radical and stuff, right? But still, it sort of it could trace itself back to the civil rights movement, right? But now their intellectual fuel, he says, emanated from a new source of shimmering radical energy: U.S. prisons. Okay, now this is going to seem really bizarre, but go with us, folks. The prisons become viewed as, how do I put it, a source of authenticity, a source of radical energy. And you've got white people who are getting to know black convicts, some of them pretty rough characters, shall we say. And because they're just volunteering to go into prisons and radicalize them, it seems like they wanted to go in and radicalize the prisoners is part of what's going on here, right?
Right, and if you think about this from a strategic level, it makes sense. Especially this demographic of prisoners, the more radical black types, are going to be your more uh, violent or total types that you would
Mm-hmm.
find.
Right.
People like to jokingly point out FBI crime statistics in the modern day. That didn't exactly, the same trend was there in the 60s and the 70s. And then you can make an argument that perhaps it was a more organized back then. You could say that perhaps their community hadn't degenerated to the point where it is in the
Mm-hmm.
modern day.
Yeah.
The type that you would find in prison in the 1960s and the 1970s were just going to be more radical and more violent than, say, who the Black Panthers were drawing from. In which case, as we found out last week, some of them tended to be a bit more LARPy. Some of them, they had a conflict of visions. There was a lot of intellectualizing and ego competitions and whatnot else. You get that in prison, but instead of solving it by splitting groups and parties and whatnot, and generally just acting very petty, you solve it by beating the other guy. So
Yeah.
this is the difference in character we're dealing with.
Yeah, and I guess in a way you could see it, not in the usual sense we mean it, but in a sort of a high-low alliance. You've got these like Berkeley white radicals, left-wing radicals, and they're looking for people. They're kind of looking for like muscle, in a way. Also, though, they're seeing the black prisoners as avatars of the oppressed, right? They really stand in for the oppressed black people. These are the most oppressed. These are the guys who the system has put in prison, you know?
Right, and I mentioned this last time, and it's gonna sound like I'm beating a dead horse. But the New Left, which is the groups we're dealing with here, these are not old Bolsheviks or anything of the sort. The New Left thrives on narratives, specifically oppression narratives,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is, it gets kind of murky whenever they get to say Southern Reconstruction, because then who's the oppressed class now? Is it the racist whites or is it the newly freed blacks? Who knows? But
Right.
whenever you look in the 60s and the 70s, For the New Left, the oppressed class becomes the blacks, especially the ones that are in prison. Because and we'll get to this, so I'm slightly jumping the gun here. They're also converting to a minority religion, which has been heavily excluded from the United States for most of its history up until this point.
Right.
So they perfectly fit the New Left's narratives, oppression narratives that they
Hmm.
need.
Yeah.
These prison blacks, they're the perfect category.
Right. Um, So he says that this unlikely alliance between charismatic black inmates and adoring white radicals. Well put. So there was some precedent for thinking this way. Malcolm X preached that prisoners held a special place in the black Muslim world, symbolizing, quote, white society's crime of keeping black men oppressed and deprived and ignorant and unable to get decent jobs, turning them into criminals. And then Eldridge Cleaver, again, his name keeps coming up. He, Burroughs says, almost single-handedly rallied white radicals to the prison reform movement. And so by 1970, the protests of Bay Area radicals were all but permanent fixtures outside the walls at San Quentin. Okay, so you've got the setting. The white radicals are being turned toward looking to the prisons, talking about prison reform. Basically, this isn't a matter of some criminals who have done bad things and are getting some kind of justice served. This is political oppression. It's not criminal justice that's going on here. It's political oppression that's going on here. Right.
Right. And this is sort of where we exit the realm of past tactics or historical tactics, because this is something that still goes on in the modern day. Um, if you remember all the different political organizations that were trying to get in favorable district attorneys and whatnot else to give low sentences, stop prosecuting, cut sentences, all
Yeah.
this other stuff, especially in the major cities. This is the intended fruits of this prison reform movement. You're getting your violent, oppressed class out of the prisons so that they can start organizing, being violent, whatever you need them to do out in the public.
Right.
This is not history. You are living with the effects of it if you live in any of those major cities that have a sympathetic DA or
Right. Right.
whatever else it may be.
Yeah.
And another thing, Stephen, because I feel like we could go down this point for too long, but there might be something to be said for the way that the prison system was made to begin with. Not that these types had a point necessarily, but maybe just locking people in a room forever wasn't the best way to exact justice.
Yeah. No. No. I'm not. I think about the law in the
Yeah,
scriptures. The Mosaic law. There's no prison. You either recompense, you make up for what you did, like you pay back the money you stole, or something like that, or basically they kill you. There-
right.
there's
Yeah,
no
there's no prison.
yeah,
Those
there's no living off society in the Mosaic
right.
law.
Yeah.
um,
Saying there's no prison in Mosaic law sounds very nice and kind-hearted and liberal until you realize what that means.
yeah, right. Uh, okay, um, so yeah, it says, he says, let's see here. Yeah, for apocalyptic revolutionaries who had long sought a constituency to rise up and fight alongside them. Because remember, the whole theme through all of this book is they're looking to get the revolution going, right? How can we get the revolution going? Remember, we talked about how the Highlander Folk School, hopefully I said that right, Ryan, the Highlander Folk School, they had decided to, the horrible oppressed West Virginia miners were going to be, the proletariat or whatever, that were going to rise up. Then they kind of gave up on them. And so they decided, well, let's try American blacks. They're always looking for who can be the ones to provide energy and manpower, frankly, for the revolution. Right. So black inmates seem to represent the holy grail for these revolutionaries. Weathermen, after all, had invested thousands of hours attempting to rally working class youth, high school students. I don't know if we mentioned it in the Weatherman episode, but they actually were like running through high schools, shouting and being crazy and stuff. Um, and black liberals who had earned little in return but snickers and shrugs. Finally, in California's toughest prisons, radicals found what appeared to be a loyal following. So by 1968, black inmates were reported to be forming clandestine chapters of the Black Panthers and a hardcore Marxist group called the Black Guerrilla Family, both of which operated extensive secret Marxist political education groups, including courses on revolutionary theory and bomb making. Yeah, so if you thought prisons were a great idea, consider that. And I've heard about this in the UK, right, Ryan? You and I would be maybe less conversant with that, but basically, somebody does a little petty crime or something, goes to prison, relatively petty, goes to prison and comes out like a nut, like they've been indoctrinated in prison into some kind of radical left wing or racial thing or something.
Right. And this is that's been a characteristic of prisons ever since they were founded, basically, but with the Quaker system that we had early on. You send these people into this like isolated cell with only a few other people, and they're the type of people that you would be exacting justice from, and they can only talk to each other, and they will grow in resentment as time goes on and time goes on. So,
Yeah.
I personally, I can't see how this system could fail. I'm
Right.
I am shocked that we have a unintended consequence of just breeding, organized groups of people that just want to destroy more things after trying
Right.
to punish them for destroying things.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember my amazing jazz piano teacher, Pops Porter, went to prison back in the 40s. And I said, oh, so did you keep in touch with any of those guys? And he said, no, they were criminals. So anyway, not everybody gets radicalized in prison, but we're going to talk about some people who did. So again, talking about how the white revolutionaries are viewing all this. The author Eric Cummins talks about convict cultism. He says by the early 70s, convicts who were released from California prisons frequently enjoyed instant hero status in radical organizations. So you could walk out of prison and into the arms of some, left-wing group or something that was going to consider you really authentic and you're going to help us, start it up, so here's a movement radical. Here's a personal witness here. Movement radical named Betsy Carr. She said, I was completely fascinated with black inmates. The glamour, the bizarreness. It was my Hollywood. I'd never discussed anything with any of them, just watched in total awe. I share this because this is just such an alien way of looking at the world. I'm just trying to share a little bit of where this all is, what happens next. You got to kind of understand this because this is going to be quite different than the Black Liberation Army in terms of who's involved. Okay.
Right, and
So.
this is very quickly. This brings to mind, there's a green text that gets passed around every so often, and it's a very crass joke, but I feel like it has merit if we take into account the ideology that these people have kind of won out mostly in the last few decades. And the simple statement is it's jokingly saying the United States exists to worship blacks, and that's definitely a lot of the criticisms that AA has been very publicly throwing out as well. And they do kind of have a point that these new left types, have basically built a religion around worshiping these people out of prison, as you just heard from the quote from the woman herself.
Right. Yeah. So it's really bizarre, right? Like he calls it convict cultism, right? He implies this has a cult-like aspect to it. Okay, so with all that context of sort of the mood of the time with these left-wingers, let's talk about George Jackson. Now, George Jackson is not himself someone who becomes a left-wing terrorist exactly, but he ends up being key to what happens next. So we just have to cover him real quick. The author says that he kind of resembled Eldridge Cleaver in a sense on paper. He had become a thug as a teenager. He stole cars, robbed liquor stores. He wanted someday to become a writer deep in his soul, right? But then he says, whereas Cleaver could grin and charm and talk for hours, Jackson was a thug with a fountain pen. far angrier and prone to violent language than Cleaver had ever been. So I'm not going to go deeply into Jackson's life, but he ends up in prison. He gets radicalized. Um, uh, he starts reading Franz Fanon, Malcolm X, Che Guevara. He begins to see himself, going with the victim narrative point that Ryan made, he begins to see himself as a victim of white society. And he starts writing letters to his family explaining his, his growing political consciousness or whatever, right? So there was things were getting tense in the prisons, and a white guard shot, let's see, 3 black inmates during a prison yard fight between black and white prisoners. And the prisoners got really mad. This was in, wait, I'm sorry, which prison was this? Yeah, Soledad. Okay, right. So in Soledad prison, this happens, and the black population starts talking about reprisals. Okay. And they're talking about it at Soledad, but also San Quentin and Folsom and all the other significant California prisons. And George Jackson in Soledad was among the loudest calling for this. And so, let's see, it was at Soledad that they did it. Really horrible. The grand jury reviewed the killings, and they ruled the deaths justifiable homicide. So they did not like that, and they took their revenge. There was a young, inexperienced guard named John Mills, alone on Soledad's Y Wing, where Jackson was housed. A group of inmates grabbed him by the throat, beat him up, threw him over a third-floor railing, hit the concrete, and died. And then the cell block exploded in cheers, it says. So then Jackson and 2 other inmates were detained, placed in solitary, and charged with his murder. And as a serial offender, Jackson faced the gas chamber if he was convicted of this, right? And so these 3 were dubbed the Soledad Brothers, and it became a big cause célèbre. Couple things to mention here. A radical attorney named Faye Stinder. She had agreed to represent Jackson after she made a name for herself as Huey Newton's co-counsel in his murder trial. So she's, got a pattern here. She has another pattern, which I should mention. Sex keeps coming into this story, I'm afraid to say. Sex and violence, right? It says, a plain woman with a smoldering sexuality, Stinder was utterly entranced by the black inmates she represented. Although married with 2 children, she would enter into a sexual relationship with Jackson, as she had with Newton. So, this white radical admiration of these black inmates, in some cases, results in them just sleeping with them, right? Having sex with them. So he got the right lady, because she hooked up with the white activists across California. She formed the Soledad Brothers Defense Committee, and it became a whole thing and a who's who of radical chic supporters, including Jane Fonda, Pete Seeger, Allen Ginsberg, Tom Hayden, and a striking UCLA professor named Angela Davis. They all get involved.
Who we mentioned in the beginning.
Yeah, they all get involved, and they're putting out posters and pamphlets and bumper stickers and fundraising letters, bake sales, poetry readings, art auctions. And I have to say this for a friend of ours, the Grateful Dead even played a benefit concert. Let all the guilty be named. Okay, so under Stinder's guidance, George Jackson emerged as the living symbol of everything the Bay Area left yearned for: strong, black, prideful, masculine, and undeniably sexual. And then one guy said, observing what happened at the time, he said he noticed how naive and starstruck Stinder and her supporters were. It was mostly women who were doing the organizing. They had each picked their favorite Soledad brother and were kind of oohing and eyeing over them like teenagers with movie stars. I mean, just bizarre,
Right, and this, we talked in the last episode about how the wider American society accepted the things that just lowered standards. They didn't go along with the effort of organizing a revolution. And one of those things was the sexual revolution, where standards just went completely out the window. This is the result of that, basically. So, we have a large section of female society basically forming a cult around black prisoners who murdered people.
Yeah,
So,
right.
um,
It's
in the span
bizarre.
of in the span of say 20 years, society went from relatively normal with a bunch of underlying problems that we've discussed before on other videos, to now we have cults coming out of prisons where white women will gather from across the country to worship, murderous inmates, basically.
Yeah, it's crazy. Anyway, cutting to the chase of George Jackson, the key thing that happened is that two key things, three key things: the trial, the crime. I guess they don't know who did it really. The crime of killing that guard, and the trial. Then, first of all, secondly, a book was published of his letters to his family. It was published in October 1970, titled "Soledad Brother: The Prison Letters of George Jackson." It was a bestseller, a critical and commercial sensation. The New York Times, you can always rely on the New York Times, right, Ryan? I'll tell you. The New York Times called it one of the most significant and important documents since the first black was pushed off the ship at Jamestown Colony. Soledad Brother made Jackson an international literary sensation, much as Soul on Ice did for Eldridge Cleaver. Okay, then let's see what happened. His brother got killed. We'll kind of skip over that. Very tragic and nuts. Okay. So then Jackson's trial is going on, and on August 21st, 1971, someone slips him a gun. Jackson takes over San Quentin's internal detention block. He repeatedly shouted, "The dragon has come," perhaps referencing the Ho Chi Minh quote, which wouldn't be surprising, by the way. I mean, these guys are reading the big communist figures like Ho Chi Minh. Right?
And specifically people like Ho Chi Minh, because that's that's a anti-colonial resistance group that
Right.
is the new left combat.
And they're meant to see themselves as in parallel to other anti-colonial movements like this, right?
Exactly.
So he's shouting, "The dragon has come." They take 6 guards and 2 white prisoners as hostage. 5 later are found dead in Jackson's cell, their throats slit. Jackson bolts into the prison yard, and snipers kill him with a single shot to the middle of his back. Okay, 6 men were dead altogether. The 5 they killed, and Jackson himself. The bloodiest day in the history of the California prison system. But it meant George Jackson, and this is where it takes us to the rest of our story here. George Jackson went from messiah to martyr. 2,000 people attended his funeral at a church in Oakland. During the services, the Weather Underground detonated bombs in protest, one in San Francisco, one in Sacramento. The author says, there are Bay Area radicals who hang George Jackson's picture in honor to this day. Anyway, Bay Area. Okay. Then, though, he had written a book that didn't get published during his lifetime, but it was published after his death. So his death was August 71. 6 months after his death, in February 72, a book called Blood in My Eye is published. And the author says it's an amazing document, a straightforward call for a bloody black-led revolution in the streets of America. It was not received with the adulation that his first book was received. The Times reviewer dismissed it. It was dismissed by critics and so forth. But, and just a passage from it to give you a flavor. "We must accept the eventuality of bringing the USA to its knees, accept the closing off of critical sections of the city with barbed wire, armored pig carriers crisscrossing the streets, soldiers everywhere, Tommy guns pointed at stomach level, smoke curling black against the daylight sky, the smell of cordite, house-to-house searches, doors being kicked in, the commonness of death." So they thought it was kind of crazy, I guess the white reviewers and stuff, but it was avidly read by prison revolutionaries, especially in California, where they viewed it as a messiah's final call to arms. And one of the most passionate readers was a man named Donald DeFreeze. And so that brings us to the title, to the main part of our story. So it goes through. I'm not going to go through it. It goes through his rap sheet, basically. You know what happened before he ended up in prison. He actually was pretty crazy, Ryan. I noticed even before he got radicalized in prison. He's carrying
Yeah.
guns around and trying to be a black market gun runner, and um, yeah, he seemed to already be kind of on the edge before all this.
And it's also worth saying as well, because we haven't really discussed this. There is a section of American Christianity that you might have been able to gather that this was going on in the background, perhaps. Specifically, the Black Baptists aren't the most orthodox, and in fact, they are very socially radical. And still
Oh,
to this day, you can find them making a bunch of crazy statements that are just pushing the bleeding edge of progressivism. Um, DeFreeze, if I remember correctly, was connected to these Black Baptist groups,
really? Oh,
if I
okay.
remember correctly.
Okay, I missed that. Very good. Um, so he gets to prison, like Malcolm X, Sekou Odinga, Eldridge Cleaver, George Jackson. He gets something from prison he had never known: time to read, time to develop his mind. And so he starts reading trash, and then he moves on to dangerous trash. And he finds the book and the man that explained it all: Soledad Brother by George Jackson. Okay. And what this teaches him is that um, none of his life was his fault. The black man never had a chance. He, Donald DeFreeze, never had a chance. He wasn't really a criminal. He had been fighting for his economic freedom when he stole, for his dignity, and repressive white government had jailed him for it. He was a political prisoner. So again, notice that transmutation. It's like a little bit of alchemy, right? I'm not a criminal who just like robbed someone or whatever. I'm a political prisoner, being
Right.
oppressed by a system, right? So it's not
I did
justice.
nothing
It's
wrong.
well, or another way to put it, Ryan, is it's a transmutation of justice, sort of classic justice, to social justice, right?
Right, yes.
Yeah.
And I was specifically going to say the left wing playbook throughout all of these cultural conflicts, if they're moderate, Fabian, in the modern day churches, or if they're these black radicals, it is always going to be weaponizing what we might call antinomianism, which is a
Mm,
fancy theological term for people basically just saying that you don't have to keep to a law,
mm.
or to be more blunt, that no, you didn't sin, you didn't do anything wrong, everything is perfectly fine.
Right,
It's
right.
basically just weaponizing and directing that to where these left wing revolutionaries can say, well, thieving isn't really wrong because these people just had too much property anyways, so you're
Yeah,
perfectly fine to just go and steal from them. Or,
right.
well, this white person was oppressing you by existing. So murdering them was more justified than if they were not white. It's weaponizing this trend to just absolve people of things that they've done
Yeah,
wrong. They don't apply it across the board. You have to keep in mind it is
right, right,
weaponized.
right. Yeah, it makes me think a little bit of in more recent times the BLA, I'm sorry, BLM and Tifa stuff, where they are burning down businesses and then um, uh, um, explaining that, well, insurance is going to pay for it. So, it doesn't really matter, right?
These rich
Um,
corporations have so much money. It doesn't
yeah,
matter if we just burn down this block of the city.
right, exactly. Okay, so what happens next? In 1970, not long after DeFreeze arrives at this prison, um, this radical group called Vacaville forms um, or approves the charter for a 2-year-old Black Culture Association, the BCA. It met 2 nights a week in the prison library, one for informal classes in Black history, literature, and similar topics, the second a social evening with a guest speaker, poetry, music, or a film. And BCA meetings came wrapped in the full regalia of Black liberation. Each began with clenched fist salutes, a Swahili chant, and the hoisting of a Black Liberation Army flag. So they're actually paying tribute to the BLA in 1970. So that's when the BLA is like shooting cops and stuff, right? Um, or I don't know. Is that connected to what we were talking about as the Black Liberation Army? I'm not sure. But anyway,
It not directly connected,
Okay.
but there's like 2 degrees of separation from the movement that is saying blacks need to get back in touch with their West African roots, just assuming that they all were West or East African.
Right.
Um, and then and then suddenly it turns into, well, this was all taken from you. Don't you want to get back at the people that took it from you?
Um, so DeFreeze joins this. He jumps right in. A lot of them adopt African sounding names. So he adopts the name Sinke Matumi. Just that first part will come up later, usually shortened to Sin. And he really got into, what this author calls revolutionary fantasy. And then key to the rest of our story is that through all of this BCA thing, he met many of the white volunteers who would eventually become part of the Symbionese Liberation Army. Okay. So, March 5th, 1973, a Soledad guard drops DeFreeze off at a fence line to do some work there, I guess, or whatever. And DeFreeze goes the 12-foot high wire fence, climbs it, tears his jeans, drops the far side, and he's gone. And what's important here is what's happening inside DeFreeze's mind. He was convinced that he was going to be the leader of a bloody revolution that would soon sweep America. 100 miles north in Berkeley and San Francisco and the ghettos of Oakland, vanguard troops were waiting for his command. He knew it. He just had to reach them. So this is very similar. You might remember with the Weathermen, people saying things like, we were so foolish. We thought that revolution was about to start and we just needed to light the fuse, like it was a revolutionary moment. But later they reflect back and go, yeah, we totally misjudged that. It was not, America was not ready for a revolution in 1970 or whatever, But anyway, this is DeFreeze's frame of mind, very similar to the Weathermen, the early on Weathermen frame of mind. So he finally finds some people who take him in. A lot of people won't, but he finally finds some left-wingers who will take him in. And he anoints himself General Field Marshal Sinke of the Symbionese Liberation Army. This name Symbionese, they don't really go on about it in the book, but it's supposed to be, I guess, the adjectival form of symbiosis. So right. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. But anyway, I didn't really get it.
Well, living together would be a rough translation.
Yeah.
So, we talked about at the beginning, there's 2 ways you could take that. One, you had the sort of white radical admiration for their black oppressed class. And then the second one is just, every left-wing rallying cry from the New Left has just been, we just want to live in peace, man.
Yeah, right.
Just let us have our violent revolution.
Right. So he quickly found a 22-year-old pharmacist daughter named Patricia Soltysik. And she liked to be called Ms. Moon. So let's see. Right. So here, again, there's this violinist thing going on here. The Bay Area had a lot of the best and brightest radicals hanging around in like the 60s and stuff, but by now it's 1973 by the time DeFreeze gets out of prison, and the stock has dropped a little. The quality of the stock has gone down a little bit. He says there were still radicals devoted to every conceivable cause the Bay Area left, but those who clung to the idea of armed struggle and the viability of an underground now ran less to the brainy Ivy Leaguers that weather underground than to the escaped convicts, janitors, runaways, and angry lesbians who would eventually, under DeFreeze's leadership, become the Symbionese Liberation Army. So they started recruiting to form a guerrilla cell to get the Symbionese Liberation Army into being active. Most of their recruits were in their 20s and active in the prison movement. These people would go into the prisons and teach prisoners to be radical or whatever. And they all believed that with the help of black prisoners, they could use U.S. ghettos to launch the kind of urban warfare that their hero George Jackson had prophesied. And then they would eventually number 8, the Symbionese Liberation Army. I'll just name them real quick. And they had these weird names. They were supposed to be like African names that they made up or something. Nancy Ling Perry went by Fahiza. Willie Wolfe went by Cujo. Yikes. Did Stephen King know that? Anyway, Camilla Hall went by Gabby. Russell Little went by Osceola. Joseph Ramiro went by Bo. Bill Harris went by General Tico. Emily Harris, his wife, I think. His wife went by Yolanda. And Angela Atwood went by General Galena. So they wrote out some of their ideas. They wanted to abolish prisons, marriage, and rent while attacking racism, sexism, ageism, capitalism, fascism, individualism, possessiveness, competitiveness, and all other institutions that have made and sustained capitalism. Remembering things I've been hearing from Caitlin Johnston there. But anyway.
I was, well, I mean, that sounds very similar whenever you see these curriculums that come out of the more radical school districts. You will see that they will say, well, individualism, productivity, scheduling, being to places on time and all this other stuff is really just a white expression. There's an equally valid black expression for all of these things. If any of you know what I'm talking about, if you remember those things that were attacking cultural whiteness or whatever it is that they called it, that should sound very similar to what Stephen just read out of this book, and that's because they all come from the exact same ideology that has basically taken over your education system. So
Yeah.
everything that we are reading in this book from this point in time onward, it's, once again, it is not history. This stuff is still bearing out.
Yeah. Hey, I wanted to. I was waiting to drop it in at the right point, but couple super chats from Lady of Shalott. Thank you, ma'am. She says when one of these guys was finally caught in 1984. So our story starts around 73, right? In 1984, one of these guys was caught. He told the police he was a revolutionary. It was 2 days before Reagan would be reelected. Pure fantasy. Exactly. And then an earlier comment, but this is the right time to drop it in. The SLA, Symbionese Liberation Army, believed that only a black or a third world person can understand the plight of the oppressed masses, hence their search for black recruits. This is really sounding familiar, Ryan, because, it's this whole thing of like, we can't have like a white actor portray someone, a role that's like a non-white role or something, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
You have to be like authentic. It's like almost like a. Well, it's a part of the oppression narrative, basically, that you've got to be part of the oppressed to really get it, right?
I was thinking about the more college side of things, where they will say, you can't speak about this because your lived experience does not match that needed to actually fully express the trials and oppressions of the topic. We need to have. We need to have an Aboriginal from Australia who's been jailed for thousands of years for just being Aboriginal to talk about Australian colonialism or something like that.
Right. There you go. Yeah, exactly. Right. So that's the kind of mindset we've got here. Thank you. Lived. What do you call it? Lived reality or something?
Lived experience.
Lived experience. Hear, that's the phrase I don't needed.
Like.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't like using that term because there is such a thing as lived experience. It's just been, it's been turned into a meme, basically.
Yeah, right. Okay, so the author thinks these guys are, pretty crazy. Like I said, things start getting weird at this point. They tried to mimic routines pioneered by the Weathermen, calisthenics, weapons training, the study of Marxist texts, even the grueling self-critical sessions, right? Maoist style self-critical sessions. But all of it was in a service to a worldview that veered between comical and truly insane. As we mentioned, DeFreeze styled himself General Field Marshal Cinque. The code names for these guys were out of some imagined African revolution, Fahizo Kujo Tiko, where Weathers' communiques alternated between hippie jargon and sober Marxism. The SLAs would arrive unmoored from all reality, a notion enshrined by its favorite salutation, a line that sounded as if it was uttered by the villain in a 1930s-era Buck Rogers serial. Death to the fascist insect that preys upon the life of the people. And this was something they would keep that phrase for quite a while. It came from
This will
DeFreeze.
resonate with the people.
Yeah, people are going to realize we're on their side. Yeah. So they launched into activism in a particularly horrifying way that even their erstwhile allies were horrified by. They briefly had a member, Theo Wheeler, a black member of the group, who an ex-con, who launched into a rant about a man named Marcus Foster, the superintendent of the Oakland school system. Foster was a nationally respected figure, but he had angered the Black Panthers and other radical groups by suggesting that police be brought in to curb school violence, and by proposing that students carry identification cards. In Wheeler's mind, this amounted to a fascist plot against black youth. This is an ongoing theme, Ryan, I've been thinking about, which is that whenever, very often when someone tries to actually improve the situation of the black community, like by, say, getting violence under control, that's viewed as oppression. And what's not being
Right.
what is not counted as oppression is when, the worst black criminals are allowed to just murder black people, and that's okay. It's like it makes no sense.
Unless the gang violence on one side is part of the police, in which case it's white supremacy, as we learned recently.
Right.
Um, but this is another thing as well. They're talking about basically, they're schools, right? They're talking about school IDs and having police and all this other stuff, which um, some public schools do have now. And your joke about the public schools being completely identical to a prison system rings ever more true as the days go on. But
Yep.
in this case, um, I would say that's probably not the worst thing to happen to the public schools. And that's because if you go back to the 1920s, that's when you start seeing school democratization being pushed by the left as a way to secure their power, specifically happening with the SPD in Weimar, Germany. They would democratize the school systems, and basically they would try to completely uproot any aristocratic elements that were left over from the old kingdom or the old empire that they had basically just revolted against. And that would carry on through, say, the Soviet Union, school democratization in name at the very least, so that the Bolsheviks could kick out any vested presences that were already in the schools and the gymnasiums. And then over here, it wasn't called school democratization, but that is being pushed in the colleges probably starting a few decades ago. Student-led classes, you start having like student organization
Right.
representation, all this other stuff, which is literally just this same old playbook being used to get the old standards of schools completely lowered so that you can have
Right.
your complete dregs dragged into the class, given exactly
Yeah.
same score as the people at the highest part, and
Right.
the left-wing vision gets to be instilled instead
Yeah,
of
and turn it into a political indoctrination institution,
right,
essentially. Right. As
right,
opposed
exactly.
to like a place you go and learn geometry or something pedestrian like
Right.
that.
So when that's your goal, this does look very fascist because they are very much threatening to completely go against your view of democratizing the schools if they do have
Right.
armed security and IDs and all this other stuff. Uh, so
Okay.
that's a perspective.
Okay, so I'm going to have to figure out how to use our time wisely to get through this whole Symbionese stuff. But November 6, 1973, the unofficial birth of the Symbionese Liberation Army, they jump Marcus Foster and a friend of his as they're coming out of a school or something. His friend survives. Foster is killed. Little detail here. When the police examined a spent slug, they noticed something odd. The tip had been drilled out. Chemists would later discover that each of the bullets fired at Foster that night had been filled with potassium cyanide. So bear that in mind. Okay.
Yeah.
But This kind of blew up in their face. It wasn't what DeFries had expected. Of course, in his delusional mind, he's leading the revolution and he just needs to do something and everyone's going to fall in behind him, right? Well, instead, Foster's assassination provoked near universal condemnation. Black leaders denounced it. Thousands turned out to attend one of the memorial services, one of 3 memorial services. The Panthers decried it, the brutal and senseless murder. And they suggested the powerful fascist elements were behind it. So they were disowning this as being a left-wing action, right? And then the next day, a strange communique arrived at a Berkeley radio station with a 7-headed cobra on it. It was from the, quote, Symbionese Liberation Army Western Regional Youth Unit. It explained Foster's murder as the result of his fascist student identification program. To those who would bear the hopes and futures of our people, it read in part, let the voice of their guns express the words of freedom. Bernadine Dorn, still in hiding with the Weathermen, issued a statement about it. She says, we do not comprehend the execution of Marcus Foster and respond very soberly to the death of a black person who is not a recognized enemy of the people. So this did not go down well. And then in their next communique, they're kind of they're in defense mode. They're defending themselves. They say the forces of the Symbionese Liberation Army remind the enemy-rich ruling class that the people will always understand the effectiveness and tactics of revolutionary justice and will never be deceived by the distortions and lies of the fascist news media. Marcus Foster has been likened to one of our slain leaders. We ask, who ever heard of a Martin Luther King on the Philadelphia Crime Commission? As Marcus Foster had served in that capacity. We are well aware the fascist news media seeks to condition us by repressing the truth. I don't think anyone was persuaded by this. So they kind of went to ground for a little while. And then on January 10th, 1974, 2 of them were caught. Just random. They were driving a little bit slowly. An officer thought they might be casing the neighborhood and stopped them, thought things looked suspicious, and then there was a brief shootout, and then they ended up catching both of them. And the rest of the Symbionese Liberation Army, of course, cleared out, so that they wouldn't be caught. This is where we get into something you might have heard of. Even I had heard of this, even though it happened when I was 4, actually. Monday, February 4th, 1974, Patricia Campbell Hearst was a very wealthy nobody. At once an anonymous daughter of one of America's richest families, and also just another headstrong 19-year-old. She was living with a fiancé. We'll get to that. That was kind of weird. At the Berkeley campus, doing art studies. Her close friends thought she was a teen rebel and not an especially sympathetic one. She'd been the only student at her private school who refused to wear a uniform, who drove a car, and who referred to farm workers as, quote, miserable fucking migrant people. So there you go. Her father was Randolph Hearst, who helped lead the family media empire, a vast constellation of magazines, including Cosmopolitan, television stations, and newspapers, most notably the San Francisco Examiner. As a 17-year-old at the Crystal Springs School for Girls in Hillsborough, California, Patty had begun an affair with her math instructor, a 23-year-old named Stephen Wood, and after she graduated, she joined him at Berkeley, where he was a student in philosophy and she was studying art history. So it was at that apartment when 3 of the Symbionese Liberation Army burst in. We think it was Donald DeFries, Bill Harris, and Angela Atwood. They hurt but did not kill the boyfriend, hit him with a rifle butt several times, and then they grabbed Patty Hearst's apartment, presumably a kind of calling card, or maybe just a mistake, hard to tell. And then a communique was issued, now by notice the subtle change here, Symbionese Liberation Army Western Regional Adult Unit. Why they changed the name, I don't know. Written as an order of the Court of the People, it identified Patty as a prisoner of war and Randolph Hearst as a corporate enemy of the people. and there was no ransom demand.
Right, and just so people are aware, that is the same Hearst, William Randolph Hearst, that we talked about, say, in the Spanish-American War stream, when we were discussing yellow journalism and the role of the media driving state policy.
Wait,
So
no, this wasn't the same. No, not the same man.
William Randolph
Same
Hearst?
family. The same family. Yeah, William Randolph Hearst Sr. is 1863 to 1951. Okay.
Yeah, that's her father, isn't it?
No, this is happening in the 70s. William Randolph Hearst Sr. was dead in 1951. So this would be his son, I think.
Okay, so this is a granddaughter then. So
I think a granddaughter of him. Yeah.
right, so the same group. Anyways, just so that you can sort of see the continuity here.
Right. So
we
Randolph
don't talk about things in isolation.
Randolph Apperson Hearst was the son of William Randolph Hearst, right? And then he's the father of Patty Hearst. So it's the Hearst family, but it is
Right.
she is William Randolph Hearst's granddaughter. That's correct.
Same family showing back up.
Showing back up, yeah. Okay, so this was a big deal, unlike a number of the things we've talked about, like the Black Liberation Army, that just kind of got forgotten to a great degree. This was a big deal, and I remember hearing about it when I was young. It became, after Watergate, probably the greatest media event of the 1970s. Says before it was over, Patty Hearst's face would appear 7 times on the cover of Newsweek alone. So there was all this coverage. Everybody wanted to know everything. It was like the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, right? Kind of a similar phenomenon to that. What was interesting is they focused on Patty Hearst. Kansas City Times noted the paranoia, the messianic posturing, the childish fascination with queer names and elaborate symbols. They compared them to the Ku Klux Klan, concluding that this SLA was sick. So yeah, they some people just called them a bunch of crazies and psychos. Yeah, and he says this showed a shift because just 4 years earlier, the Weather Underground's bombings had been viewed, however briefly, as a semi-legitimate response to Nixon-era policy. That, with her helping, they have a recording of her voice as well, along with DeFreeze's voice, I believe. They deliver this saying that you've got to feed the hungry. Initially, it was going to be an estimate of like $133 million. And even Randolph Hearst was like, I don't think that's going to happen, man. Sorry. So they kind of negotiated back and forth, and they did a $2 million. Agreed on like a $2 to $4 million handout of food. And they did it. The crazy stuff happened back then, man. Wow. So it was a colossal and chaotic undertaking. Tons of donated and purchased groceries loaded onto rented trucks at a San Francisco warehouse, then ferried to supermarkets in black neighborhoods across the Bay Area. And it was just chaotic, and people are fighting. But they continued to do deliveries through March of this would be 70. Sorry, I keep losing the year I'm on these things. We're in 74. Yeah, so this is throughout early 74, this stuff is happening.
From one of the recordings, I just find the language really funny. With Patty saying they weren't trying to present an unreasonable request. It was never intended to feed the whole state. So whatever you come up with is basically okay.
Yeah, she's basically talking to her father, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then, interesting. The Weather Underground was kind of confused by all this. Weather's Paul Bradley says the Patty Hearst thing was great, giving out the food, all of that was great. We all thought their rhetoric was ridiculous. None of us paid much attention to the Marcus Foster killing, a horrible thing. Frankly, that they couldn't bring themselves to be critical of these nuts,
Right.
Okay, so they kept Patty Hearst in a closet. I won't go through all that. You can read her own account of it that she wrote later. She marveled at how sincere they seemed, how they genuinely seemed to believe they were leading a revolution that would in time change America forever. And they just like peppered her with Marxist rhetoric. And then one in the SLA was free to have sex with anyone else. No one was forced to, but it was considered comradely to accept any sexual offer. This is a
Hey,
theme that
you
goes
remember
right back to our very first episode, Ryan, right?
exactly as I say, you
Yeah.
remember the very start of this series when,
Yeah.
basically the same thing happened 500 years beforehand?
Yep, exactly. Um, and so Willie Wolf comes and has sex with her, and then DeFreeze has sex with her. Patty remembers lying there like a ragdoll, just waiting for the sex to be over. So she's being raped. I mean, this is not exactly a consent situation, shall we say? Um, and then finally, they say the War Council has decided you can join us if you want to, because she's taken this attitude of, I just need to say what they want to hear from me, and so she starts repeating back the Marxist rhetoric they're spending hours spewing at her. She starts repeating it back to her, and so they say, hey, we're impressed with what we're seeing here. Um, you can join us if you want to, or you can be released and go home again. This is a critical moment here. Patty wrote later that she never believed they would release her. The choice she felt was between joining them or death, which is what they had said earlier, that you can join us or we'll kill you. But now they're saying, oh, you can join us, you can go home again. She's thinking, yeah, if I don't join, they're going to just kill me. Without a moment's hesitation, she blurted, I want to join you. You'll be an urban guerrilla fighting for the people. Yes, she said, I want to fight for the people. So, thus begins one of the most bizarre episodes. Patty Hearst, how voluntarily, we can all debate, but in de facto, she became a member of the Symbionese Liberation Army. And she participated in the actions that they did after this. They finally take off her blindfold. She'd been hearing their voices, never seeing them. And going to the Bioleninist theme, Ryan, Patty's first thought was what ugly, depressingly ordinary people they all were. Their voices had been so much more impressive. Now that you've seen us, Angela Atwood asked, what do you think? Oh, you're also attractive, Patty lied. Well, DeFreeze said, all freedom fighters are beautiful. Anyway, this is just nuts. Okay.
It's painful to read almost.
Oh, it's cringe. It's cringe. So she's accepted into the group. She's issued combat boots, a carbine, a new name, Tanya, after a noted Cuban revolutionary. And they start doing combat exercises with her and all that. And then they do their first action together. They identify a target, a branch of the Hibernia Bank. And I believe it is out of this. Yeah, it is out of this that we get one of the most famous images from this episode. A bank camera photo of Patty calmly holding a gun on customers became one of the decade's iconic images and provided the first evidence that she had in fact joined the group. So
before we move on to stuff like that, like there's a couple of details in here. We were talking about how our first episode is kind of the ideas that we laid out when we were brainstorming what really makes something left-wing violence.
right.
There's a detail in here that I think might interest the audience that
Please.
might bring someone back to Munster communalism, where it says that Patty began using the SLA's communal toothbrush, which she found disgusting.
Good detail. Yeah.
I can't help but think back to the Munster Anabaptists, where everything was supposed to be held in common, which basically just meant the lead prophet got to take whatever the heck he wanted to, and everyone just had to go along with it.
Yep, exactly. Right. Thank you. That was a striking detail. So they hold up this bank. They end up. It's all going off pretty well until two people wander in, and the one of the SLA opens fire. They both survive, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. And then get away with $10,600, which might not sound like so much now, but this is 1974. And so this was a big turning point because now they went from, oh, this poor Patty Hearst who's been kidnapped, to going, okay, is she participating because she wants to, But it also, of course, stepped up their attempt to find these people. So then they needed more followers, and this is, again, just so many bizarre things happen here. So DeFreeze and Bill Harris decide they're going to try to find some new recruits, by knocking on doors in the apartment building that they're hanging out in. Just random people, in essence, right? I guess in a black neighborhood, but otherwise random. That didn't work out so well. So then they went out into the surrounding neighborhood and began knocking on doors. And here's the crazy part, to give you a sense of how crazy those times were. This worked. They literally just randomly found someone who would help them. So they found a black Muslim woman. So that would be Nation of Islam, right? A Nation of Islam woman. She brought them food. She found some others who were willing to help them and help them make a move. Randolph Hearst announced a $50,000 reward for Patty's return. And so DeFreeze was like, okay, we got to make a move. We got to get out of here and kind of disappear, you know. It says, after about 3 months as being part of all this, Patty Hearst wrote later, she was losing her grip on her old identity. After 3 months of intermittent death threats, untold hours of political indoctrination, she had grown numb and was increasingly willing to do whatever DeFreeze and the others told her to do.
Kind
Yeah.
of like a Maoist camp.
Yeah. Anyway, there's no point in talking about, her possible guilt or whatever. Just a horrifying situation to be thrown into randomly. Okay, so I'm going to skip over a bit. They have various adventures, but they end up most of them get caught at a track down to an apartment, and it's just an absolute slaughter. It's deadliest single day in the history of America's radical underground. 6 people dead, not a single lawman had been hurt, but it knocks out a whole bunch of them, including Donald DeFreeze. They won't give up, and finally the SWAT team just chucks something into the apartment they're in. They're shooting out from there, at the law officers, and the house goes up in flames, and they find their body. Some of their bodies later just burnt, But Patty Hearst was not with them at the time. So all of this, and they did not find Patty Hearst. So that should have been the end of it. The fiery destruction of those many of the members of the SLA, including Donald DeFreeze himself. I don't know if I emphasized enough. After Theo initially, gave them the idea of killing Marcus Foster, he did not really want to participate in deadly violence and disappeared, left the group. And that left Donald DeFreeze as the only black member. So what we have, right, Ryan, is a black liberation group that has one black member, the leader, and then he gets killed, and now there's no black members.
I mean,
and they
just
soldier
sounds
on.
par for the course for these people.
They soldier on, right?
Yeah.
So he says, by all rights, the fiery destruction of the SLA should have brought an end to what little remained of the underground movement. Instead, it reinvigorated it. They started calling for more people to take action. So part of what happened is that it just got a lot of attention. The food program, the crazy food program, the handing out of food from the Hearsts, the humbling of the Hearsts, the publicity, the magazine covers. Some people, he says the vast majority of Americans viewed the SLA as a tiny, bizarre cult, but those still inclined to believe in armed struggle viewed these as achievements. They had done something. They had gotten attention, right? The underground was part of the conversation again. And so this actually kind of got things going again. There were bombings, there were robberies, resulting deaths. And against all odds, this extended the life of the radical underground into the 1980s. So this is like my whole youth. All this craziness is going on. And except for vaguely remembering about Patty Hearst being kidnapped, I don't remember hearing about any of it. Like we did not. This was not a topic of family conversation. Oh, there's been another bombing in Berkeley or something. I just don't remember any of this. It's crazy. Um,
And keep in mind as well at this point in time, the channels of media are much more centralized than they are now. I could see if this stuff were to happen today, you would have 60,000 people having videos of it on every social media platform that have witnessed the whole thing. But back at this time, uh, you heard news from these established media corporations. So if, say, I don't know, the State Department decides we need to make sure that this does not hit the news for the interest of domestic security or something like that, they won't, because you've only got to contact, like, oh, I don't know, what was it, 8 or 9 families or something like that, and these things will just never hit the news to the common people, or at least national news.
yeah. So then they get another member, Kathy Solia, Soliah. I don't know how to say that. She had actually been rejected by Bill Harris originally. He said she was too flaky to be trusted with the SLA's underground activities, but she was this huge fan of the SLA. She arranged a, uh, um, a protest rally when the all those SLA folks died in the shootout with cops. Um, and so the Harrises, who were still alive and with Patty Hearst, decided to contact her, and she was thrilled to become part of it. And then Harris announced that the SLA lived on, now operating as a unit of something called the New World Liberation Front, the NWLF. So they started doing things under that name, which ends up getting used by someone else who we'll cover. By the way, given our time constraints, Ryan, I'm thinking of just mostly skipping the FALN. We might get to it later.
Yeah, yeah.
But just to kind of
But
keep it focused on this story. The things are happening at the same time. Right? That's part of what happens. Kathy Solia, had formed with a group of radicals. She helped form a study group called the Bay Area Research Collective, or BARC, BARC, and they began publishing Dragon, a mimeographed journal that would become the landmark paper for underground groups. And it would publish bombing news and communiques from almost all the second generation underground groups, especially those on the West Coast. And BARC indicated it was affiliated with the New World Liberation Front. Okay. And in an issue, Dragon carried a letter supposedly from the NWLF in which it invited anyone and everyone to detonate their bombs in the name of the NWLF. A tactic it acknowledged made the group seem larger than it was. And at first, not much happened. That was in Mayish or something. But then there was a first NWLF bomb on August 5th, 1974. It was a dud left outside General Motors. But then a communique announced greetings and love to the Symbionese Liberation Army. And then September, 2 bombs, NWLF bombs, shattered windows outside a stock brokerage firm. And then after that, the bombs began going off on average every 16 days. So the NWLF became one of the great mysteries of the underground era. NWLF bombs would still be exploding long after Harris and his acolytes were off the streets. So, in other words, originally they thought, oh, okay, this is a rebranding of the Symbionese Liberation Army. Once we stop Harris, the remaining parts of the Symbionese Liberation Army, then we won't have any more of the bombs, but we'll find out. They stop Harris, they catch Harris, and then the bombings keep going. The NWLF would be credited with planting more bombs than any other underground group, more than twice as many as the Weather Underground. And it's not very well known because he says the truth about the group, or at least part of it, would not emerge for years. Also, what happened, and I don't want to go into this in great detail, but the Weather Underground got back to bombing. So they'd been kind of disappeared out of view. And the Paris Peace Accords happened in January 1973, as recently discussed on the Old Glory Club channel, by the way. And so that was the end of the Vietnam War, and that kind of took some of the fuel out of the passion out of the left wing uh, movement, right? Um, let's see.
Yeah, they no longer had their very exoteric and public cause for
Yeah,
action. You know,
right.
the war is over. Now you just have to either come out and say, actually, we just want open revolution because that's all we've ever wanted,
Right,
which
right.
isn't the very good thing for the public side of this movement to say, or you do just say, go home, it's over. And they can't go with option number two.
Right. So, spring of 1974, the Weather Underground does produce something. They produce a book called Prairie Fire: The Politics of Anti-Imperialism, which they kind of write together. You can probably get a copy of it, I suspect. But originally, they didn't trust any publishers, so they hand printed, or not hand printed, but they printed it themselves. And it says they cranked out 5,000 copies of the book, each assembled by hand with gloves. And spring of 74, it was ready to be released. And then they launched a trio of attacks. They did some bombings in protest of the Symbionese Liberation Army killings, the killings of the SLA, rather. The San Francisco cell bombed an office of the California Attorney General. Um, and They put out a communique. They included an excerpt from Prairie Fire. So this is like marketing for their book, right? They blow something up and put out a communique. Here's a little excerpt from our forthcoming book. You should get it. You know, it's crazy. And so they basically just drop it off at alternative bookstores and radical organizations in a dozen cities. This one lady says she never forgot walking into the Brooklyn Women's School to find them. They just arrived out of nowhere, a big pile of books. We were all told we had to study this book, and we did. Our desire to read the book was due to the mystique of Weathermen. We thought they were doing important things. They were underground. So Prairie Fire was widely read in radical circles, noticed in the mainstream, garnering a brief article in the New York Times. And again, like Dragon, it served as an invitation to new groups to take up the cause of armed struggle. And within months of Prairie Fire's appearance, they began to strike. Now then, there's a whole set of horrible bombings which get people killed that start, let's see, when's the first bombing? Like August 74. Yeah, August 74. But this is a Puerto Rican independence group called the, oh boy, Spanish. Okay. Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional Puertorriqueña. Spanish for Armed Forces of Puerto Rican National Liberation, or the FALN. So I won't go into all that, but they started hurting cops, blowing up police cars, and then a particularly horrible bombing in Wall Street at a Francis Tavern, which was a historic place where Washington had given his emotional farewell address to his officers in 1785. They blew that up and killed several people there. But anyway, I'm going to kind of skip over that. Okay. Right. Okay, so now let's wrap up the story of the Symbionese Liberation Army. So it was June 1974. This would the beginning of what they would call Patty Hearst's lost year, a period when she and what remained of the Symbionese Liberation Army vanished from view. Remember, she had been very publicly, there had been recordings of her voice. There was a bank camera with her being involved in a heist. I mean, she was like getting public attention, and everybody's very interested in the case. And then it just went dead, after Donald DeFreeze and the others were killed. It just radio silence for a year. So they called that the lost year. It says, by this point, Patty wrote years later, she had abandoned any hope of leaving the group or escaping. She thought of herself as an SLA soldier and was resigned to whatever fate that brought. So they ended up staying at a farmhouse in New York, a remote place in New York for a while. let's see, there was a lot of sexual politics. Everyone was having sex with everyone, it seemed. Everyone was angry about it, so they're all arguing with each other. And then, let's see, they all went to rob a bank. Okay, yeah. And they said, get your noses in the carpet. One woman didn't move fast enough, Myrna Opsel. She had a heavy adding machine, and rather than fall to the floor, she hesitated. So Emily Harris from the SLA turned and blasted her with a shotgun. Years later, she claimed the gun went off accidentally, but Myrna Opsel
So,
bled to death.
funny you should mention this because earlier on, I had one of my friends, a Lutheran as well. He mentioned that his sister was married in the church where Myrna Opsel was the secretary,
Mm,
um,
wow.
SDA, Seventh Day Adventist. So I was wondering if that was going to come up because he did literally just message me and he said they shot this harmless church secretary with a shotgun for no good reason.
Yep. Yeah. Um, Patty Hearst was in the getaway car. She wasn't in the bank. Um, so her murder and press accounts that labeled this job an SLA style robbery convinced them it was time to get out of where they were at that point, which was Sacramento. The new recruits took news of Opsel's death the hardest. For the first time, Patty said later, the romance of revolutionary violence began to fade. And then Harris announced that they were renewing their war against the fascist U.S. government. In DeFreeze's honor, he said they should carry out his dream and begin killing policemen. Right? If they killed enough, he reasoned, the police would crack down on the oppressed minorities of the Bay Area, who would then rise up and begin the revolution. Now, notice that, right? This is an accelerationist tactic, right?
Yes, that's
Um,
exactly what it is.
yeah, and I always like to remind people that this was what Charles Manson was up to. His intention was to have his family kill these well-known people or rich white people and make it look like black people did it. I never heard exactly how they were going to make it clear that black people did it, but anyway, it was the point was to convince people that black people were doing these horrible murders, which would cause retaliation against the black community, which would cause the black community to rise up and start the race war that Charles Manson wanted, because he was evidently a left winger of some strange variety, right? The line gets really blurry here, I have to say, between, political left wing figure and just insane individual that happened to be living at the time and repeating some of the. Anyway, I
Insane individual who wanted to kill people. Yeah.
yeah, right, right.
Can you tell these two people apart? No, many such cases.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's see what they do. Yeah, they planted a bomb under a patrol car that destroyed the car. They did a communique. Remember pigs, every time you strap on your gun, the next bullet may be speeding toward your head, the next bomb may be under the seat of your car. In the only nod to the SLA, they used DeFreeze's old sign-off line, death to the fascist insect that preys on the life of the people. And then, let's see, they tried to plant some bombs, but it failed. They tried to do something clever with, like, when the car moved, it would trigger it, but they didn't really know how to do it. So when it drove off,
Isn't that
it just lay there. What?
isn't that what the Zodiac killer threatened? Being as that was basically happening at the same time back in California. Didn't he send
Are
out
you?
threats that he would?
I'm not sure.
What was that?
I've got the book, but I haven't read it yet about the Zodiac
So,
killer.
like, this is just how crazy these times are. The
Yeah.
Zodiac killer, who most people today probably know, was happening. Those killings were happening at the exact same time
Yeah.
that we had liberation fronts bombing the country. With hundreds of bombs.
Right. My goodness. Yeah. So anyway, they tried to do these two bombs under cars. The bomb just fell off one of the cars, and they checked nearby cars, found the second one before it could explode. So that just failed. And then Hearst says everything pretty much spiraled out of control after that. They all got really mad. Harris, the male Harris, was shouting at everybody, becoming more and more dictatorial. Um, um, she was wanting to leave, but they persuaded her to stay. Patty Hearst, you're a symbol of the revolution. One told her, you give the people hope. And then finally, the FBI closed in on them. They found the father of the Solia, Kathy Solia, and I think there was another Solia involved. But anyway, they found the father, and somehow the FBI agreed to send him in without any wiretap or whatever. And he wanted to convince his children. I think he had 2 children in the group. He wanted to convince his children to get out of this craziness. And so nothing really happened except that he mentioned one detail. His son, oh, I see, Steve Solia and Kathy Solia, brother and sister, were in this. His son had mentioned one detail, that two of the members were painting houses, and so they just canvassed everywhere. Houses were painted, showing pictures, and then they were able to track those people and track them, and finally were able to arrest all of them. I don't think they killed any of them in this case. I think they just they got Patty Hearst, they got a couple others that they arrested, and I think the Harrises actually disappeared. No, I don't know. Anyway, so capture Patty Hearst was front page news. When was this? September 17th, 75, I think. I think we're in 75 at this point because that lost year. It says she was arraigned on charges of robbing the Hibernia Bank, that first job where they had the picture of her, right? Asked her occupation, she famously replied, urban guerrilla. I mean, what does that mean at that point? I don't know. Yeah, a bunch of them disappeared and went underground. And then something strange happened. These bombings kept going, as we mentioned.
Right, but before we move off of all that, you can kind of see how, as each movement collapses, there's less gusto with how they're going out of style. Like, the Weathermen had this giant bombing of a very major government building in DC, and then they basically just said, "We're going underground now. Goodbye, everyone." Or was that before? But basically, right around the same time where they start collapsing in relevancy. The BLA had this giant shootout where they were all attacking cops. Bombs had been thrown. Everyone had just like been shot and killed. It was sort of like this revolutionary martyrdom. And then the SLA, they all died. They started killing random people, and some people got captured. And it was it's just kind of going down like criminal gangs and ordinary lawbreakers now, instead of a giant organized movement trying to bring about the revolution in the nation.
Yeah.
That bio-Leninism you mentioned earlier, by this second generation, it's really kicked in.
Right. So the NWLF accelerated the pace of its actions in 1975 after starting bombings in 74. They detonated 37 explosive devices by the time Hearst was captured, an average of 1 every week for 9 months. There were so many bombings that an FBI man termed San Francisco the Belfast of North America. But no one had been seriously injured thus far. And then let's see. Okay. Now, I'm trying to remember why Jacques Rogier is key here.
But that term though, the Belfast of America, we mentioned last week with the BLA that it was sort of looking like the Troubles, because you had random people that were just going about New York City or other American cities that had plans to just up and shoot somebody and make it look very sort of casual, like they were just there, they shot somebody, now they run. Um, which kind of looks like what was happening in Ireland at the time, where you would have people out in the middle of the day in a very populated city that would just take out people because they were either Protestant or Catholic, or part of one of their respective paramilitaries.
Right.
Um, and then over on the other part of the country, not the exact same place, you basically just have bombings going off once every week.
Right.
Most people, especially my generation, have probably heard there was a conflict in Ireland. That sort of hit popular culture for whatever reason.
Yep.
It's popular to hate British people or something. Um, and the IRA, or a communist group that actually seemed to have gotten what they, or at least part of what they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then in the United States, we had we had quite a lot of bombings over a somewhat long period of time. We had, grenades being thrown in cities. We had people being randomly gunned down in the day or in the night, depending. And we don't have nearly the same sort of classification. If this were another country, the American media would have termed this a low-level war, because you have organized groups that are actively fighting against the government, actively carrying out measures that would be appropriate for a war. It's just they aren't a country, so it can't be a full war. It has to be low level. It's sort of odd how we classify these things. There's no hard line. It's whatever fits the narrative.
So wrapping up the story of the NWLF bombings, they just continue with various communiques, often asking people to like help the poor or something, and they seem to do a lot of bombing of PG&E. So I think that's Pacific Gas and Electric, the California Power Company. I'm not sure why they were so upset at the energy the electric company there, but on March 14th, 1978, a bomb went off outside a PG&E substation in suburban Concord, California, I believe. A communique expressed support for a coal miners' strike. Oh, okay. Well, the coal miners would have been working for PG&E, right? After 4 years and 100 or so bombings, the precise number remains in dispute. This would prove the final NWLF action, the final communique. And again, along with this, on this theme of things being weird, the NWLF, it turned out, was the only underground group to dissolve after an axe murder. I'm not kidding. So NWLF, it turned out, were unconnected groups that had decided to use the name, which was sort of invited, hey, do stuff under this name, right? Various radical people. So this was not as centrally organized. There were a couple different groups that did bombings, but the one that did the most, probably 70 or more, was carried out by a third group. And this centered on a deeply troubled man named Ronald Huffman. Ronald Huffman grew a lot of marijuana, high quality marijuana, evidently, on his land. And he did bombings with his woman or wife, or I don't know if she was his wife, but I'm sorry,
And
what was her name?
it's while
Yeah,
you find that out, it should
Maureen
also be
Maureen
mentioned.
Minton. Maureen Minton. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, he was also a drug smuggler beyond just marijuana. So, uh,
Oh, was he? I
you know,
missed that. Mostly it was
we're
about marijuana, but
right. But the thing that I have here, with Mr. Huffman, is that he was, there was an arrest at 20 when he was 23 for smuggling heroin-filled balloons across the Mexican border. So, yeah, we're kind of entering contemporary issues now. If you haven't got the hint yet, so the
right.
people tied into a lot of these things. It's not just, oh, they're only drug smugglers, as if that would be enough to absolve them of drug smuggling. Um, they also apparently are bombers or tied to other sorts of terroristic activity. So
Yeah.
I just a
Craziness.
point to connect there.
So just to wrap this up then, Ronald Huffman is doing these bombings with his girlfriend, Maureen Minton. And but they have a very stormy relationship, shall we say. They have a worker who helped tend the marijuana farm. And he reports that he became increasingly frightened of Huffman. Huffman developed a long list of complaints against Minton, his girlfriend. She hadn't watered the wheat enough, or she'd watered it too much. She'd neglected to give their dog his heartworm medicine. She didn't respect Huffman's grandfather. Huffman's lawyer would later claim that his client believed that Minton herself was possessed by demons. And Huffman was incensed that she had had an abortion against his wishes, or that's what he said. And then he told the worker Morgan that he was going to get rid of Minton and find himself a new lady, one who could bear him children. So whatever the deal was, September 23rd, 1979, after all these... Wait, no. The last bombing had been 78. Okay, so March 78 was the last bombing by the NWLF. September 79, over a year later, he orders Minton to kneel before him, lifts a long-handled axe, swings it viciously down under her skull, all but splitting her head in two. And then it gets really weird. He beats her body, hoping his attorney would later claim to knock the demons out of her corpse. Then he takes a scalpel and cuts out a section of her brain, because Huffman believed Minton's brain matter had magical powers. So this is getting completely insane. So he grabs some cash, some marijuana, and a paper sack containing a portion of Minton's brain, and drives off and ends up getting arrested. Yeah, police arrest him,
very
and
high quality human stock.
Yeah, they put him on trial. Not sure whether he's even fit to stand trial, but they decide he is. He pleads not guilty by reason of insanity. And they found him guilty of second-degree murder. And then they unsealed a months-old indictment against Huffman for the bombings. And they all had statutes of limitations, so he was charged with conspiracy. And he says, but then the story made the front pages of the San Francisco papers and disappeared after a day or two. The last, his trial, it all, between, getting caught and the trial and everything, it was years after the bombings had stopped. Yeah, April 1983 was when he was finally faced trial and everything. And so Huffman was probably the 1970s most prolific bomber, but it kind of just disappeared as a story. And in fact, he says he pled guilty, he went to prison. No one connected with his case, including his attorneys, has a clue what happened to him after that. And this author, I think, found an administrator in the Santa Cruz County District Attorney's Office confirmed that Huffman died in a California state prison in 1999. And then one other thing to note, I don't know if we're going to come back to it later in the book, but Kathy Salia had avoided arrest and was finally arrested in 1984 after going to ground. Let's see, fugitive for decades. Oh, I'm sorry, arrested in 1999. So she was not arrested till 1999. Pled guilty to attempted murder related to a failed bombing plot. And in 2003, to the what was the lady's name again that got killed in the bank robbery?
Sorry, I completely got rid of that. Give me 4 seconds, and I will find that. It is Myrna Opsal.
Yeah.
Opsal?
Yeah, she was sentenced to 14 years in prison. She was mistakenly released in 2008 due to an error made in calculating her parole and rearrested. And then she was released on parole in 2009. And then arrested with several others for blocking Interstate 94 in Minneapolis during a protest. That's been one of the things that's been interesting to me, by the way, Ryan, is that a number of these figures, if you look them up, you find that they've continued to be left-wing activists. After they had this whole life in the underground and then got arrested and spent time in prison, maybe they just go right back to it, basically. I mean, maybe not blowing things up, but they go back to the same politics, like None of these, I haven't seen any of these people who like change their mind really. They changed their
Well,
tactics,
like,
but they didn't change their mind, you know?
right, and then the people connected to it that weren't even like the subject of a trial or a bombing or something. People like Angela Davis, who we've mentioned twice now, is still writing the theory and the expositions that will turn into probably your child's educational material in the public schools in a few years.
No, that
Still
is a really
going.
good that is a really good point. We could say that this is just, deservedly obscure 1970s trivia because what does it really matter? Those were crazy times and it's all over, but I think you're making a really good point. Those crazy times, the people from those crazy times are like in charge now,
Yeah,
right?
or not directly, but
Yeah,
indirectly in
yeah,
charge. They are feeding the regime
yeah,
everything they want to throw into the public schools.
right.
For in that one example.
Right. And so, I think I'm not alone in feeling like things seem more and more crazy in terms of the rhetoric, the racial rhetoric and stuff, anti-white rhetoric and things like that. But you dig into the stuff we're covering as we cover Days of Rage, and it all sounds very familiar, actually.
Right.
Right?
We've been here before, just in a
Yeah.
different way.
Right. Right. Well, it's similar to the transition to the Long March through the institutions, from violent revolution to the Long March through the institutions. I think it's the same sort of thing, right? They were blowing things up in the 70s, and then they end up being like college professors later, and yeah, writing the propaganda that's going to be promulgated to your kids. So they chose a different path, but the goal never changed. I don't think is my point.
Right.
Right.
And I think part of this is because they did not realize just how much they won with the civil rights legislation and its implementation. Um, I have a feeling if
You
the most of
won.
these radicals saw what we have right now, I bet you they would be absolutely weakened because most of their ardent supporters would basically just say, well, we basically got what we want, 90% of it. You hardliners can keep going, but you know, we they have control over the educational curriculum. They have control over several prisons. They have controls over who knows how much of the legal system now, from the lowest to the highest levels. They have control over multiple corporations through DEI initiatives. Not full control, but enough control to actually influence companies.
Right.
I don't think they realized how much they won in the '60s necessarily.
Yeah, you mean they had already won before the bombings started? You're saying they
Yeah,
had already won because of culture being downstream from law, to use AA's formulation, right? Academic
yeah.
agents formulation. Yeah.
Or in this case, it's not even necessarily the culture that's downstream from law. It's literally just that those pieces of legislation and all the people that stayed in place as a result just keep making more laws and more
Yeah.
legislation, more policies for state, government, corporation, whatnot else,
Right.
schools. The culture has definitely gone along with it, but that's even a secondary issue here. The laws that we have right now are being interpreted, legislated, enforced by these people and their
Right.
adherents.
Right. Right. And it was a good point you made about like the George Soros district attorneys, right? Letting people back out on the streets during the middle of the BLM Antifa violence. They get arrested and they're literally back out doing the same thing the next day, right?
Yeah,
It's
or just
really,
saying we're not going to prosecute theft now or something like that.
yeah, right, right, yeah. If you steal under $1,000, basically just walk away free, right?
Right.
Um, so anyway, wow. I don't know that I have any closing thoughts. I mean, it's just continues to blow my mind. I feel like I'm learning. I am learning the history of my times. You know, like this happened all through my childhood, and I was only dimly aware of it. Now, to be fair, I was not growing up in San Francisco or New York, where maybe I would have been a little bit more aware because of the bombings that were happening there, for example, right? Some of the
Mhm.
crazy stuff that was going on there. I was in St. Louis in the middle of the country, and we had relatively less. There was some stuff that happened. My own university, WashU, had its ROTC burned down or bombed or something like that. Um, and then part of our Black Liberation Army story, um, some of them ended up getting caught in St. Louis when they were
Right.
kind of running around the country fleeing. Um, so it touched here, but it just wasn't top of mind, you know. And of
Right.
course, the media does have a great deal of control because they could have put a great deal of emphasis on that, on all this stuff, right? All this left wing terror and said, "Isn't this terrible?" You could imagine if someone else was the media, someone were of our perspective, there would have been a lot of emphasis on left wing terror, and
Yeah.
we do not want to let these people or anyone sympathetic with them anywhere near our institutions, our children. Instead, they get the keys to the city. Basically, is what ends up happening. That's your point.
Right. And I think one of the dates that you threw out was 1999. Was that one of the trials or arrests or something like that for one of the leftover members? That's 4 years before I was born.
Yeah.
So which is insane given that all of this starts with the civil rights movement. And it apparently ends just a few years before I was born. And that's the civil rights movement is history. It is in the history books for me. To think that the fallout, the direct fallout of that, reached into the late 90s, probably even the early 2000s, because as is admitted by our good author here, most of the stories aren't known. Who knows what else is out there that we just that we don't have and we will never have. So um, I will once again make the point because everyone needs to have a takeaway from this that this is not just history. This is the direct prelude and the actual goings on right now. It's all starting here and continues. This has not ended. There has not been a new left that has taken over from these people. They are ascendant in multiple facets of life right now.
Um, yeah, there's an interesting article to give you an idea of how this stuff is treated. Like I said, if it, you know, sort of in my view, the proper way to treat these people would be as pariahs. People who should not be respected or sympathized with, or certainly let near any of our cultural institutions. Instead, thanks to Full Code, pointed out this article. I'll drop this in the chat. Here's an article from the New York Times Magazine in 2001 called "Was This Soccer Mom a Terrorist?" It's about Kathy Salia, and it's basically a sympathetic article. I'm sorry, it's about Kathy Salia. It's about uh, General Tico, Bill Harris, basically former Symbionese Liberation Army people. Um, and it's I haven't read it, but our commenter says that it's basically a sympathetic portrayal of these folks.
Right, and
Um,
one thing that I would like to draw from the comments, just because I can't word this any better, and I'm not just going to steal it for myself. Full Code says it's amazing that one guy lost his university job for liking a tweet, but these people's careers and education weren't even deterred by murder.
right.
Um, I That's exactly what it is. And they can and do get away with things like murder, terrorism, bombings, aiding and abetting, and all this other stuff. Um, but you are not allowed to think or express your satisfaction or dissatisfaction with certain things without losing your livelihood, basically. That is how the system is. And anyone that tries to soften it or make it something different is lying to you, and they're trying to obscure the problem so that you can't solve it. But that is just the lay of the field right now.
um, it's just amazing. I mean, this article, as indicated by the title, "Was This Soccer Mom a Terrorist?" is talking about how they have kids and they're being dragged back to jail again about this old stuff. Why can't everybody just let it go? I mean, does anyone care when somebody gets canceled, like you said, for a tweet or whatever, that's considered anti-left in some way, right? Um, does anyone care that they have kids, that they have a family to support? No. It, let
And
them be.
oftentimes,
Let them die. Let them starve.
if you look at the more radical fringes, sometimes they'll just use that as an even bigger reason to cancel them. The more antinatalist types, if ever there's a a witch hunt out to get someone. Look at how many kids this person has brought into the world. How dare they?
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so I can expect no mercy for having 8 children from those guys.
Yeah, you can probably expect about the opposite times
The
8.
opposite. Right, right. Yeah. He's ruining Mother Earth, right, with all those children. I have run into people who are like that, by the way, in real life. Boomers,
I
you know. Boomers.
I can
It's
only
incredible.
assume that you have the patience of a saint.
Well, it just stuns you, you know. It's like, what is this insane person actually saying these thoughts out loud to me, you know? Or like my daughter said once, somebody's talking about complaining to my wife with all the children there about how she's had too many kids or something like that. And my daughter's like, she didn't say this, but, my daughter says, I'm standing there right there thinking, hey, we're like right here. Do you want to like point to which ones you think shouldn't have been born, you know? Anyway, it's just incredible, the madness that people get into. Okay, anyway, I guess we've said what we want to say on this. I would like to finish the book. It's pretty crazy, and I have to say I'm really engaged, Ryan. I'm really enjoying the book. But my struggle, as I mentioned on that interview yesterday, which I should share, in case you haven't seen it, I think you might enjoy it. It's sort of a teaser for the series, but I thought I got good feedback on it and everything. So
Right, and it might be worth at this point to reissue the call. If you have a around
yes,
30-second clip from an episode, this one or any of the other ones that you think was good for whatever reason, send that in to us, and we can turn that into a clip to be used to advertise the channel and the show. So this was already done by someone unaffiliated with us, or with Stephen and I, as far as I can tell,
yep.
or at least directly
From
unaffiliated.
from the Patrick Casey interview that I just dropped a link to in the chat. Yeah.
Right. So, something like that. It could be funny. It could be hard hitting. It could be a point that you just haven't heard before. It could be related to a current event. It could be something from the past that we predicted 2 years ago that has come to light now that you want people to know. For whatever reason that you think these things would be good, send in the timestamps to us, and we will have something professionally edited.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. I did mean to bring that up again, so thanks very much. Okay. Yeah. So in our world, justice is not done, right? But or at least right now. um, and it's just incredible that these people are sitting there talking to a New York Times reporter about their kids and all this stuff, you know. And oh yeah, I noticed just skimming through the article, he says Bill Harris is upset at Patty Hearst. Yeah, I have no animus toward Patty Hearst, but I'm disappointed that she continues to lie about us. And I don't know what he's talking about there, but that caught my attention. So, anyway, so crazy stuff. Okay, so next week, I believe, should be an Econ Minis with Black Horse, and then we'll continue on. I'm hoping to finish, there's quite a bit left in the book, but I'm hoping we'll finish Days of Rage in about 2 more episodes. It doesn't seem quite as focused as we continue, Ryan, where, there was the Weathermen, there was Black Liberation Army, Symbionese Liberation Army, and then, I don't know, it seems like just a lot of different things happen as the story goes through the late 70s and into the 80s. I guess we could focus on the FALN. It's not as clear to me that they belong in the Left Wing Terror series.
Well, we can assess that. It's more, we were talking about how as each iteration of this goes on, the quality becomes worse and worse. So
Right.
is it really any surprise that by the time you hit the 80s, you can't even get like a coherent narrative out of them just because it's so frayed and disorganized?
Right. Yeah. But it's amazing that it just kept on going. I mean, the radicalism that starts in like the mid 60s, I guess, radical political violence and stuff, goes on for like 2 decades. I mean, not as strongly, right? It's more strong at certain points, but it continues for like 2 decades. It's just incredible. Okay, anyway, thanks everybody. Really appreciate everyone joining us for this series. I hope you're finding it interesting. I have to say my confidence was built a little doing that interview with Patrick Casey, just because I'm kind of briefly touching on different things we've discussed in the series, and people in the comments are like, wait, where's this channel? So people were getting excited about the Left Wing Terror series, so that kind of encourages me. So I hope folks are getting something out of the whole series. And we may stop with Days of Rage, Ryan. I don't know that I had anything else I wanted to. We weren't exactly chronological, but we kind of roughly went chronologically from like 500 years ago up to now the United States in this era. There's a lot. We could go on forever, right? But
And we said at the beginning of this is an inexhaustible topic,
Yeah.
so we might as well hit the major points.
Yeah. So we'll see. Other people have suggested other ideas, and nothing exactly has made me feel like, oh, we've got to cover that before we stop the series. So we might just conclude with Days of Rage, unless one of us gets inspired or something. So, okay, thanks everyone. Oh, can we announce about the Mises conference?
Well, I have been confirmed for something, so if our audience is interested in stuff coming from me and our friends and all that, then that is something. So would you like me to go over it?
Yeah, please. I feel like
Okay.
it's a chance to meet up with friends if they want to do this, and it's an event that I think you'd agree people would find really interesting. I mean, it is not boring to go to this event.
Right. It's very in-depth, but not boring. So the Austrian Economics Research Conference 2023, for those of you in college, it happens on spring break. Usually it's sort of in the late middle of March. I have a paper that was accepted for me to present there. And a mutual friend of Stephen and I also had the same thing happen, though he's not known to our community. That's just a reason for Stephen and I to be there on top of that. So I'm going to be there presenting. It's going to be on the broad topic is the managerial revolution and what happens now. But I'm sure that there will be many other good friends there, and I'm not just sure, I'm certain. So that's going to be something to attend. Last year was an absolute blast, and then the year before that, I believe you went with Charlie, isn't that right?
Charlemagne, that's right.
Yeah. So
it's a great place to meet up and learn a lot and meet some very interesting people.
And the topics vary quite a lot, so you're not going to get pigeonholed into one specific thing. Like Austrian economics is like this really narrow discipline.
No.
Last year we focused on like there was like entrepreneurship happening in one room, everything to do with that very broad subject. And then the next room, I think it was something like American economic history or something like that. Like you have a lot of variety, and then you go in for like, someone gives a speech on like C.S. Lewis and value. So and there's a lot of just great personalities to meet there. Like we had a few ex-Soviets, or like not like the Union fell and then they begrudgingly left, but people that actually saw communism and then left. Which is sort of like an old conservative talking point at this present time. But especially for me, I didn't get to see most of those people. They're sort of before my time, so the fact they're still around is pretty cool.
Yeah, and we'll are happy to talk to you and answer your questions.
Yeah.
So I'll be there. Ryan should be there. I believe my daughter will be joining me as well. One of my teen daughters. Would love to meet up with you there. We have a friend who works. We have kind of a friend from our circles who works at the Mises Institute, who we meet up with. Anyway, so it's a good gathering and intellectually stimulating. It's a lot more fun than an economics conference ought to be, but it just is. So don't be put off by it being called an economics conference. Hopefully you find economics interesting, and that's why you're at this channel. But even if that's more of a peripheral interest, if you find history interesting, as Ryan hinted, if you find political philosophy interesting, there is going to be something for you at this conference.
I mean,
it's really
even
cool.
if it's like last year, theology was a quite often discussed subject outside the conference, sort of in like the intermittent areas, and also in some of the speeches and discussions. There was a gentleman that gave a presentation last year on E. Michael Jones. So, you don't know what you're going to find there, but it's going to be interesting.
I forgot about the E. Michael Jones. Woo! Spicy. Okay. So yeah, hope to see some more friends there. It's a great time to gather together. All right. Thanks everyone, and see you next week.